Well, thank you for joining me on another episode of Resisting the Winds. I hate to be the How to Be Christian YouTube channel's watchdog, but that's kind of what I'm becoming. The page has just blown up, especially since Matt Fradd promoted it, and it's really low-level apologetics. I don't say that to be rude or to cover up any insecurity. I'm part of Facebook discussion groups of very high-level Roman Catholic apologetics. So I'm not saying high-level Roman Catholic apologetics don't exist. I'm not saying anything like that, but this just isn't it. And so it's just impossible for me not to pass up an opportunity when he promotes content specifically addressed to evangelicals, Protestants, to not address it. So I'm probably going to keep that up for some time. Now, before I get into the content of this most recent video that he just posted on Justification in Romans chapter 4, I have to say something about my polemical style in this. If you were to read the literature of, say, Calvin or Beza or Turretin, some of the magisterial reformers and their successors, they did not refer to Catholics as Catholics. Now, were they trying to be insulting? I don't think so. I think they knew it was insulting and they didn't care. But I don't think they made up that word just to be insulting. The idea was they didn't believe that Roman Catholics could rightly be called Catholic. They didn't feel like they could truly call the Roman Catholic Church Catholic. The word Catholic is an ancient word in the Christian faith. It's a very important word in the Christian faith, and so they didn't feel it was accurate or honest to refer to Roman Catholicism as Catholic, or as its adherents are as Catholics. And so you will often find them using other terms to describe them. Things like the Romanists, promoting Romish religion, because that is the heart and soul of what the one of the main things that separates Roman Catholicism from Protestantism, from the different Protestant denominations, different Protestant churches, and from the Eastern Orthodox Church, is its view of authority, of Rome and the papacy, and everything else kind of comes from there. So their main distinguishing element is their Roman see and their pope. And so the reformers thought it would be more accurate to refer to them as the followers of the pope. And so they were often, in all of the literature, they're referred to as papists, papistry. I like that the reformers do that, and I actually prefer that term. But in modern day apologetics, I think it gets in the way. People, Roman Catholics are offended by it, and then I would rather have a substantive conversation about the theology than bicker over the names. So I typically don't, in any of my encounters with Roman Catholics, whether it be online or in person, I don't use the word papist. But I'm doing it here to make a point, and it's a really important point, I think. And that is, and you're going to notice this, I'm not going to take time to stop as the video goes, so that's why I'm just giving this as a preface. What this guy does and How to Be Christian is he loves to distinguish between Protestants and Christians. And you're going to see, he even promotes a video, Protestant versus Christian. And you're going to hear him do it over and over again. And the reason I think that it's important for me to sort of fight back, to answer the fool according to his folly, if you will, is because he knows that this is, in his own worldview, an improper distinction. If you disagree with me, you need to read Vatican II. You need to go and you need to read Vatican II, which is infallible, authoritative Roman Catholic theology. And in the Vatican II documents, in multiple documents, but primarily in, I think it's on ecumenism. It'll have a name not in English, I can't remember what it is, but on ecumenism, it talks about Rome's relationship to Protestants and to Eastern Orthodox, and it's very clear that we are Christians and that we are separated brothers. So from the Catholic's perspective, you are forced against your own will, against your own logic. You are not allowed to anymore. It's been decreed. It's been declared that Protestants are Christians, and so is the Eastern Orthodox. And he knows this because I've heard him in lots of videos while he makes the Protestant versus Christian distinction, he will also at the same time refer to us as Protestant Christians. So I know that he does consider Protestants Christians, and I know that he believes, and he has to believe, that we rightly fall under the branch of Christian. So then why does he continue to constantly do this Protestant versus Christian thing? Whatever his motive is, I think it's to some degree intentionally inflammatory. I think to make a point here, when I address how to be Christian, I'm going to do what I don't normally do, which is I'm going to address him as a papist. So this is a Christian response to the papist interpretation of justification in the book of Romans.
We asked him to be a little more specific and said, what questions do you have about Romans 4, 1 through 12? And William said, well, it specifically says that Abraham was justified by faith, not by works, and it doesn't specify of the law after that word works. And William points out that this argument seems to be used by a fair amount of Protestants. So that's a good question from William, and that verse does tend to be used by a fair amount of Protestants because it doesn't have that of the law after it. And we have a video on works of the law. The link to that is in the description, also up here in the card. So it's easier for Protestants to trick Christians with that because it doesn't have the of the law. And if the Christian that those Protestants are talking to has not read Romans, then this argument that William is bringing up here could end up tricking you. So anyway, someone here asked William, have you read the book of Romans in context? That's always a good idea, especially when you're hearing a Protestant jump to a specific text in an attempt to try to make it sound like it's proving their point. As we see time and time again here, Protestants are always just going to specific verses or specific passages and just ignoring the context. Because when you add context to the verses, they never teach Protestantism. Check out our series, Christian versus Protestant. You'll see it a lot. They'll go to specific verses, out of context, put it in context, doesn't say what they're saying anymore.
First and foremost, this is not a Protestant thing. Everybody likes to jump to verses to prove a point. I cannot tell you, to talk about justification, how many times I have presented justification by faith alone, sola fide, and the first thing out of a Roman Catholic's mouth, well, usually it's on Facebook or online, so I use that figuratively, but the first thing that they say is, but James says that faith without works is dead. So what are they doing? They're jumping to a single verse. So they like to take verses out of context, but James says that we are justified by works and not by faith alone. James 2:24, again, out of context. So of course, whenever we tell someone what we believe and they ask, why do you believe it? We're going to jump to a verse. Ideally, yeah, whenever we discuss theology, we would discuss whole books of the Bible. But we usually just don't have that kind of time. So yeah, if somebody asks me, why do you believe in faith alone? I might jump to a passage of Romans, a small passage of Romans, or a small verse in Galatians. I don't know. What do you want me to do? Read the entire New Testament to somebody? So here you have a Roman Catholic saying, Protestants like to go to this verse. I don't know how to respond to it. This is a classic example of poisoning the well. Poisons the well by saying, Protestants this is what they love to do. They love to take verses out of context. They love to just jump to individual verses out of context. But what he's done here is he's poisoned the well, and he's taught his Catholic listeners that anytime you disagree with a Protestant and they throw you a Bible verse, it's automatically out of context. It's automatically out of context. He's poisoned the well. So before these Roman Catholics even hear the verses in the future and examine them, they just automatically know. They think now, well, this is definitely out of context. They're definitely deceiving me and trying to trick me. This is just classic poisoning the well. It's a logical fallacy right away. But let's actually now let him get into Romans 4. By the way, the title says Romans 4, 1 through 12. He's not going to look at that. He's not going to look at 1 through 12. He's going to look at one word in one verse of Romans 4. And then he's going to show a graphic that has some highlighted words in Romans 3. But we're really not, he's not going to walk through Romans 4, 1 through 12. So if you were hoping for that, you're going to be disappointed.
Anyway, what Protestants do is they go to Romans 4. They say, hey, look, it says work here. That must mean all works. Already that doesn't make sense because if you go to Ephesians 2, we can learn that God did work to save people.
Oh, wait a minute. Why isn't this taking a verse out of context? Why isn't this proof texting? Right? So look, he just did what he poisoned the well for Protestants for. When a Protestant says, here's what I believe, and what does he do? Oh yeah, well, Ephesians 2:4 says this. Well, that's interesting. Now, by the way, what this is about, there is a backdrop to this. He's already kind of mentioned it in his other video. I'll break this down a little bit more, but just so you are definitely caught up. His position is that all throughout books like the book of Romans and book of Galatians, Paul talks about how we are justified by faith and not by works of the law. In his reading of that is that phrase, works of the law, is only regulated to not just the Mosaic law, but a specific subset of laws within the Mosaic law, specifically what we call the Jewish identification markers. And that basically ends up just being circumcision and maybe the dietary laws. So he essentially interprets this as what Paul is actually saying is we are not justified by works of circumcision or circumcision, or specifically just any of the, what we call in the Reformed tradition, the ceremonial laws, the Jewish ceremonies, the things that mark out whether one is a Jew or a Gentile. And so what his Catholic friend here is asking for help on is that while Paul usually does say that we are not justified by works of the law, there's sometimes where he doesn't say that. He just says we're not justified by works. And one of them is in Romans 4. And so he's basically asking, okay, so when Paul says we're not justified by works of the law, I know how to refute the Protestants on that. That's just about circumcision. But what about these other places where he doesn't say works of the law, what we do? And so here, this becomes his answer. So let's rewind a little bit and hear it in context.
Anyway, what Protestants do is they go to Romans 4. They say, hey, look, it says work here. That must mean all works. Already that doesn't make sense because if you go to Ephesians 2, we can learn that God did work to save people. So clearly this can't be teaching that no works are necessary to be saved because God's work is necessary to be saved. So when you bring that up with a Protestant, they'll have to say, yeah, okay, I understand God's work saves us, but this work is talking about all of our work. So I'm not saying all works, including God's works. I'm just saying it's all of our work. And they might think they just saved themselves, but actually they just prove that that work there isn't defined. At least not by that passage alone, because that passage doesn't say that this is not talking about all works. But we can read other passages like Ephesians 2 and find out, okay, well, we can't possibly be talking about all works because God's work does save us. So when a Protestant admits that, then they've already proven that Romans 4 is unclear as to what this work means. Now that alone does not prove that the Protestant side is wrong, and it also doesn't prove that the Christian side is right. So how can we find out what this works here is talking about? We can just back it up a chapter, and it's very clearly talking about works of law, and specifically circumcision. You go to the next chapter, they're still talking about circumcision. So what do you think that the work that they're talking about here is referring to? We already know it's not all works because God has done work to save people. So chances are it's probably talking about the same works that were just being discussed in Romans 3, the works of the law, specifically circumcision. Because at the start of Romans 4, we're still talking about some kind of work, and we're specifically talking about circumcision. So next time you hear a Protestant trying to use Romans 4 to try to say that faith alone and no works will save you, you could just introduce them to a little friend called context. Who's a good boy?
So we have all throughout this beginning portion of Romans chapter 4, works not justifying, and it doesn't specify works of the law. And so he says, well, how do we define this term works? Well, go back to Romans 3. Well, and apparently Ephesians 2. But you don't actually have to do that. Look at verse number 1. What then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh? I would argue the context of verse 2, for if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. So these are things that Abraham is doing. So yes, we know that this is not talking about God's works, but it can't be works of the law. Why? Because Abraham lived before the law. The law was given through Moses, and Abraham precedes Moses. So Abraham cannot be justified by works of the law because there's no such thing as the works of the law when Abraham was in existence. And that's really important to this overall conversation. But the point is, you don't have to jump right back to Romans 3. And I think one of the more difficult things that he skipped over when he just jumped right back to Romans 3 and didn't deal with the passage that came right before was the logic of Abraham's. Paul says in verse 2, for if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So, according to before, without even jumping back to Romans 3 or to Ephesians 2, Abraham's justification had to be accomplished in such a way that he would have no room for boasting. And this is one of the strongest arguments why we know how to define the word works here, and how we can know that it's not works of the law or works of a new law or works of any law, because any works gives him room to boast. Jonathan Edwards made this point. This is what Jonathan Edwards said in his essay on justification by faith alone. It is evident that when the apostle says we are not justified by the works of the law, he excludes all our own virtue, goodness, or excellence. This is evident by the reason he gives that boasting might be excluded. If we are not justified by works of the ceremonial law, how does that exclude boasting as long as we are justified by our own excellence or virtue and goodness of our own, or works of righteousness which we have done? And that's a great question. How does it make any sense at all to say, listen, Abraham was not justified by circumcision. He was justified by all of those other good things he did. Therefore, he has no room to boast. If anything, now he has more room to boast, because circumcision is just one work. And for Abraham, it was a little bit harder of a work because he had to do it himself. But everybody else after Abraham, it's not even their work. Other people circumcised them. So, if anything, you could try to make the argument that I don't have room to boast by being saved by circumcision because I didn't even do anything. So it makes no sense to say, look, Abraham, all Romans 4 is saying is that Abraham wasn't justified by circumcision. Well, then how does he not have room to boast? If he was justified by living this amazing, excellent life and not by circumcision, then he's got a lot of room to boast. So we need to define works here, not just by going through and putting in bold print all the times the word circumcision shows up. That's not context. That's not even proof texting. That's proof wording. That's just saying, look, the word circumcision is in here a lot. Therefore, this word must mean circumcision. That's really bad hermeneutics. That's really bad. And that is not explaining the context of this at all. A better, closer examination of the context is actually walking through verses 1 through 4 and seeing that the reason that Paul says Abraham was not justified by works was to take away his ability to boast. And if Abraham was justified by all of his righteous works except for circumcision, then he has a lot of room to boast. And Paul continues in this. To the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but what is due. So again, does Paul seem to be talking about just one or two works from the ceremonial law? Just circumcision and maybe the dietary laws? No, he's talking about works in general. He's talking about a person who lives righteous life. If God is going to reward those, then what is that? That's a payment. That's a wage. That's not a gift. That's not grace. So if my justification is given to me because of my works, then you can't call it grace. You can't call it gift. It's payment. It's what I'm owed. It's what I'm due. And that's why Paul compares this to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the godly. His faith is counted as righteousness. So notice how Paul is not comparing a uncircumcised person who tries to earn salvation versus a circumcised person who tries to earn salvation. He's not comparing circumcision to uncircumcision. He's comparing works which earn something, which puts God in my debt, and faith, which is just a gift, which is just relying on God to save you. So if you actually walk through verses 1 through 6, and really all the way on through, you can come to a much closer conclusion as to how works is being defined without just merely doing this bird's eye scope of Romans 3 and 4 and highlighting words that appear a lot. And I think Romans 4, 1 through 6 clearly is talking about works as a general category, not just circumcision. But let's go back and do a little bit more refutation. I want to show you the inconsistency of our papist interpretation. There is the fallacy of equivocation that must go on in the papist apologetic throughout Romans 2 and 3. So he very condescendingly, he brought context into the screen like a puppy dog. And
you could just introduce them to a little friend called Context. Who's a good boy?
Well, context is about to bite. Context is about to bite back. Because what we're going to see is that the Roman Catholic apologetic cannot consistently interpret works of the law as just ceremonial works throughout chapters 2, 3, and 4. They have to do the fallacy of equivocation, where we take this works of the law phrase and they interpret it just with whatever is most convenient to their system throughout Romans 2. And not just throughout Romans 2, throughout Romans 2, 3, and 4. So let me try to prove that. Beginning in Romans 2, God's judgment in the law. This is, speaking of proof text, there's a proof text in here. We're going to walk through this whole thing, but there is a proof text in here that Roman Catholics love to jump to. And you're going to see how damaging their interpretation of works of the law becomes. Paul begins in Romans chapter 2, "For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law." Now let me ask you this question. When a Jewish person in the first century died and went to heaven, was he only judged by whether or not he was circumcised? Was he only judged according to the ceremonial works, or was he judged according to the moral and civil ones as well? Clearly, the law here is the whole law as a unit, especially concerning the moral element. Why? Because this is how the person is being judged. This is how sinners are being judged. Does our papist friend want to interpret the law in Romans 2:12 as just the ceremonial works? Let's continue. And this is the famous proof text. Other than James 2, this is the other proof text that papist apologists love to jump to. If you say we're sola fide, we're justified by faith alone, they will jump to Romans 2:13. Ready? "For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified." Now, let's take the proof text out of its context and interpret it the way Roman Catholic apologists do. That is, when I stand before God, I cannot get to heaven unless I have done the law. I will be justified if I am a doer of the law. Now, what's interesting here is, what does this mean? What does the of the law mean there? Does this mean that the way to be justified is to be circumcised? Notice the huge problem we have right now. Our papist apologist wants to interpret works of the law or of the law as being circumcision. And the only room he has to budge to expand it beyond circumcision, it's just the ceremonial law. So it's circumcision and the dietary laws and the not trimming your beard, whatever else falls under just looking and acting Jewish. Apparently, the way someone is made right before God is by observing the ceremonial law alone. You don't have to observe the moral law, right? So the 10 Commandments, you don't need those. You won't be judged by those. You won't be judged by the 10 Commandments. You will only be judged by things like circumcision. Even though, what's their interpretation of Romans 2, 3, and 4 in Galatians? Circumcision doesn't justify you. Circumcision doesn't save you. So when it comes to Romans 2:13, yeah, the law means the moral law. But then once we start talking about it in Romans 3, no, that's not the moral law. That's just a circumcision law. Equivocation. The fallacy of equivocation. Why does of the law mean the moral law of Moses in 13, but it means the moral law nowhere in chapters 3 and 4? Let's continue. "For when the Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law." So here's what Paul is saying. We have a law written on our hearts as Gentiles, and even people who never received the law of Moses tend to have this instinct within them that they know the law of the precepts of it. This is why generally even nations that don't have the law of Moses know that stealing is wrong and murder is wrong, and they become a law to themselves when they, by nature, do what the law requires. Here's what's interesting. So how do we define the law here? Is it just circumcision? Or is it the moral law? Are you telling me that what Gentiles know by nature is not to eat pork and to be circumcised? If anything, the only thing that's excluded from this verse would be the ceremonial law, because that's what everyone clearly doesn't know. The Gentile nations, some Gentile nations actually practice circumcision, but generally speaking, the Gentile nations were uncircumcised, and they didn't have this kind of dietary system. Again, all throughout Romans 2, we have the law here, and they are not going to interpret it according to just circumcision, just the Jewish ceremonies. This is clearly inclusive of the whole moral law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Jesus Christ. Again, are the Gentiles on Judgment Day going to be judged by circumcision and pork? Or are they going to be judged by the moral law? But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve what is excellent, because you are instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind and a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. So let me ask this. Is it just the Jewish ceremonies that the Jews felt was the embodiment of knowledge and truth? 10 Commandments? No, not the embodiment of knowledge and truth, just the ceremonies. Was it just the ceremonies that instructed foolish and children? No. So clearly, I mean, we could walk through, I'm telling you, just walk through all of Romans chapter 2 and try to get away with, oh, the whole law is all about circumcision. Notice here, he even breaks it up. He even compares circumcision to the rest of the law. For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. So are we supposed to interpret verse 25 as this? For circumcision is indeed of value if you are circumcised. But if you are not circumcised, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision? This makes no sense. Here we have him discussing the law, and the only thing excluded from it is circumcision itself. Oh boy. So you see, equivocation. We can continue this into Romans chapter 3, by the way. Look at verse 19. Now, whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. So let me ask you, in verse 19, is this not clearly the law here is a description of the revealed will of God? Not just the Jewish ceremonies? Clearly it is. It is not just the Jewish ceremonies that make the whole world accountable to God. It's the moral law as well. It's the heart of the law also. Love neighbor, do not steal, love God, do not worship idols. These are his entire moral precepts are what make the whole world guilty and accountable to God. So verse 19 uses the law, and it's clearly bigger than the Jewish ceremonies. And then verse 20, the very next verse, for by works of the law no human being will be justified. And then guess what he goes on to say? It will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes the knowledge of sin. So again, I ask you, is it just the Jewish ceremonies that bring us the knowledge of sin? Do we need the 10 Commandments to know the knowledge of sin? Of course we do. So 19 and 20 clearly discusses the law as being bigger than just the Jewish ceremonies. So why on earth, when it says in verse 20, by works of the law will no human being be justified in his sight, should we interpret the law here as just being the Jewish ceremonies? But all around these three verses, the law here, that's the moral law. And this, the law, that's the moral law. But what about, no, that's not. This is what Jonathan Edwards says. It is evident that when the apostle says we cannot be justified by works of the law, he means the moral as well as the ceremonial law, by his giving this reason for it, that by the law is the knowledge of sin. It is a miserable shift and a violent force put upon the words to say that the meaning is that by the law of circumcision comes the knowledge of sin, because circumcision, signifying the taking away of sin, puts men in mind of sin. He cannot, the way he wants to interpret this word here, he cannot consistently walk through Romans 2, 3, and 4 with that interpretation. He's going to bounce back and forth arbitrarily. Look at this also. I think this is an explicit place in Romans 3 where Paul expands this. Then what becomes of our boasting? Notice this is the same argument that leads into Romans 4. Paul is very concerned that we are not able to boast. And if you are justified because of your perfect or really, really, really good adherence to all of God's moral prescripts, I'm sorry, you have room to boast. You just do. And Paul wants to take away our room to boast. Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded by what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by the law of faith. So look at 27. Paul has clearly gone beyond, hypothetically even, he's just gone beyond the works of Moses' law. Is there any law that can save? No, you need faith. Look at Romans 3:31, right before Romans 4. Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. Here's a good question for our Papist friends. Do they uphold the law of God? They probably say yes. So do they eat pork? Do they wear mixed fabric? Do they eat shrimp, crab? Do they trim the sides of their beards? Do they honor Sabbath on Saturday? All of these ceremonial, actually the Sabbath is not ceremonial, but all of these ceremonial laws are the very things that Roman Catholics and Protestants alike believe have been fulfilled and gone away. But Paul's saying we uphold the law by faith. So obviously, he has an expanded view of the law so that he can speak, at least in general terms, that once we believe in Christ, we don't discard the law, we actually uphold it. But if you want to define as the law just as circumcision, or just as the Jewish identification markers, then you need to start telling all of your fellow Roman Catholics that they need to become Jewish. You have to actually promote the Judaizing heresy of Galatians and a little bit in Romans. You have to promote it because in Romans 3:31, Paul says, by faith we uphold the law. And you have already told us multiple times that the law is defined just as circumcision. So by faith, we all need to be circumcised. We need to uphold the Jewish ceremonies. A proof that Romans 4 is not just talking about circumcision is found in the fact that the way our Papist friend wants to interpret works of the law, he has to arbitrarily bounce back and forth on that term and its definition throughout these 3 chapters. He can't be consistent. So this definition just falls apart. And you can see it falls apart by just working through the text. So you want to talk about being tricked, you want to talk about being duped, you want to know the easiest way to dupe someone is just flash up the verse in bold common words and then say, look, that's how this other word is being defined. That's not hermeneutics. First, I argue Romans 4 is actually talking about something more expansive than works of the ceremonial law of Moses. The second thing that I argued is that his definition of the law cannot be read consistently in Romans 2, 3, and 4. It's the fallacy of equivocation. He has to arbitrarily change the definition when it doesn't suit his worldview. The last thing I want us to point to is that this whole apologetic of this is just about works of the ceremonies, works of the law equals ceremonial law. That's only focusing on one half of the equation. But consistently throughout Romans 3 and 4, Paul is telling us not just what won't justify us, but what will justify us. And it doesn't actually prove the point to say, well, here's what won't justify. The Protestants are wrong about what won't justify us. But then completely ignore and not sufficiently interact with what Paul says will justify us. So let's go back and look a little bit at Romans chapter 3 and Romans chapter 4 to see a little bit of what I mean. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. So how does Christ become your propitiation? How do you receive the grace and gift of God that provides for you a redemption in Christ Jesus? How do you receive all that? To simply say, not by the Mosaic law. Let's just assume, let's just go with it for a minute, that every time Paul says works of the law, he just means circumcision. Okay, so we're not justified by circumcision. Got it. So how are we justified? How do we receive it? Does he say by faith and by works of the moral law? By faith and works of the new Christian law? No, there's only faith. Faith is alone here. That's the only way we receive it, faith. So not by works, but by what? Works and faith? No, not by works, but by faith. This was to show God's righteousness because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be just and the justifier of who? The one who works the new covenant law? The one who works the moral law and not the circumcision law? No, he is the justifier of the one who has faith. Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded by what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by the law of faith. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. So again, just assume that the Papist is right about how to define apart works of the law. Okay, got it. We're not justified by circumcision. Got it. Not justified by being a Jew. Okay, good. How are we justified? By faith. Or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of the Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. So again, we can bicker and debate all day long. What does works of the law mean? How are we not justified? But isn't that ignoring the positive presentation that Paul gives? Don't just focus on the negative. What's the positive? We continue into Romans 4. What then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So again, belief only, belief alone. To the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as what is due. The one who does not work, but believes. So what's being compared here? Is again, I know I've made this point already, but what's being compared? Is it working without faith to working with faith? No. Is it the ceremonial law versus the moral law? No. None of that is what's being compared here. What is being compared here? Compared here. Faith to works. Works to faith. The positive presentation, let's ignore the negative. What's the positive? How are we justified? Faith. How are we righteous? Belief. And there's the great passage of imputation, but I want us to focus on the particular terminology. And this is really good. I won't read it. 9 through 12, the whole point is that circumcision, and this is what Jonathan Edwards was getting at in that last quote. Circumcision was the sign of being justified by faith. And Paul continues, for the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be the heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For it is adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression. Edwards has a commentary on this verse as well. He says this, it is evident that the apostle does not mean only the ceremonial law, because he gives this reason why we have righteousness and a title to the privilege of God's children, not by the law, but by faith in that, quote, the law worketh wrath. Now, the way in which the law works wrath by the apostle's own account in the reason he himself annexes is by forbidding sin and aggravating the guilt of the transgression. So again, Romans 4:15 has to expand this definition. That is why, and what's the conclusion of 4:15? That is why it depends on faith. Does it depend on faith and works of a new kind of law? Depend on faith and works of the moral law? No, it depends on faith and only faith in order for the promise to remain. And that's why his conclusion, therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. So this, by the way, is what context looks like. This is what hermeneutics, exegesis, context looks like, not by merely putting in bold all the time the text says circumcision. How would I summarize my points here? I would say, first and foremost, Romans 4 is not talking about just circumcision. Second, his definition of the law, if you were to actually apply that to every time it's used in the context, it would fall apart. It can't be read consistently. And then lastly, he's ignoring the other side of the equation. He's focused entirely on what Paul means when he says we're not justified by works of the law. But he has not interacted at all with the fact that Paul over and over and over and over again says we are justified how? By faith in works? By faith in works of a different law? By faith in works of a moral law? No, by faith and only faith. Sit down with your Roman Catholic friends and just walk through the text, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, love each other, treat each other well, ask hard questions, but don't be fooled by these kinds of quick presentations which poison the well, commit the fallacy of equivocation, and ignore the context altogether while claiming to be looking at the context. That's all I have. Thank you for listening, for following along with me. I really appreciate it. As always, maintain the gospel, maintain the fight. God bless.